Mr. Hollis, I don't think the company has any further questions to call at this time. Does the union have any witnesses they would like to call?
Yes, we would. We would actually like to call Mr. Blanton.
Please proceed.
Sure. So, Mr. Blanton, if you would state for the record what you or your experience with this and what you know about the incident.
Okay. Well, let me pull this up. I wrote some stuff down because I've never been in one of these things, so I'm a little nervous. I just want to make sure I get it right.
I understand.
I worked on March 30th, and I performed my duties to the best of my ability until I became sick about 3 p.m. During that morning, I cut some of the grass with my union witness. I installed some window blinds in the yard office and did some other chores. I swept, mopped, and emptied trash cans. I had lunch between noon and 1 p.m. and went back to work. I went down the road with the union witness, Kevin, to pick up 40 bags of ice from City Ice Plant. We brought back the ice and delivered it to the ice house. That took about 40 minutes. After that, we picked up some trash and wood that was lying around the yard and took it to the dumpster at the back of the yard. That was just before 2 p.m. A little after 2 p.m., I went and got the weed eater. I cut weeds for a while and the trimmer quit. I saw Kevin coming out of the office and asked him to help me restart the trimmer. That was around 2:45 p.m. It started but then quit again. I couldn't get it going, so I took it back to the storeroom. The storeroom is at the back of the office. From there, I went to the yardmaster's office to get a Band-Aid for a cut on my finger and for some salt tablets. I was feeling sick to my stomach. I thought it was very hot that day, unseasonably hot, over 90 degrees. The yardmaster pointed out the first aid box to me, but there weren't any tablets, the salt tablets. I fixed my cut and went over to the switchman's locker room. I was sweeping the floor in there when I felt sick again. I went to the restroom. I threw up in the restroom. I was real weak and dizzy, so I laid down on the bench. I heard someone come in about 3:30. The next thing I remember was the superintendent of terminal and lieutenant special services asking me to get up. I told them I couldn't get up right away because I was sick. Superintendent asked me how long I'd been in the building, and I told him about 40 minutes. I don't understand the charges against me. I was doing my job. The place is such a mess, and there is so much to do. There is no way I could possibly get it done in one day. I did the things I thought I should start with. I know how to mark off sick and who to tell. I didn't tell anyone before 3:45 p.m. because when I got really sick and had to lie down, no one was around. It was near the end of my shift, and I just couldn't get up right then.
All right, thank you. So, Mr. Blanton, a couple of questions. This was your first day working at this new location, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And what shape would you describe the yard and the office being?
Well, where should I start? It was horrible. I mean, every stuff was filthy. It looked like the yard offices hadn't been cleaned forever.
Okay. And your testimony was that it was impossible for you to be able to get all of the janitorial duties done that needed to be done in one day. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And the janitor position includes a variety of different duties. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And were you given any instructions for what order of duties took priority for that day?
No, sir.
Okay. And on the date in question, did you, to the best of your ability, did you perform the duties that were associated with your position?
Yes, sir, I did.
Okay. I don't have any other questions at this time, but subject to recall.
Mr. Blanton, I have a few questions. I believe you previously stated that you're an experienced janitor who understands his responsibilities and duties. Is that correct?
Could you repeat the question, please?
Well, let me rephrase the question. How long have you been a janitor?
Probably 8 years.
So in your capacity as a janitor, have you ever cleaned an office or a storeroom?
Yes, sir.
Have you ever mowed grass?
Yes, sir.
Have you ever maintained and kept an engineer's or switchman's wash and locker room clean?
No, I don't believe so, sir. I was on the extra board.
Have you ever handled baggage or mail before?
No, sir.
Have you ever replaced any posters or bulletins?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So is it fair to say then that you're an experienced janitor?
I guess so.
And so part of being an experienced janitor, is it part of your responsibility then to check posted job bulletins?
I suppose so.
And how many times had you worked at Davis Yard?
I don't remember.
Okay. But not very many.
I don't think so.
Okay. So it would be reasonable then to assume that you would especially want to check for any new or updated bulletins, since that's not your regular duty station.
Yeah, I guess so.
So you also stated that you were in fact lying down in the storeroom when you were found. Prior to being found in that prone position, did you tell anyone that you were sick?
I couldn't. There wasn't anybody there.
Did you, when you went to the yard office to get salt tablets or Band-Aids or anything, did you tell anyone there you were sick?
No, sir, because I wasn't at that time.
Then why did you need the salt tablets?
It was hot. It was hot. I was feeling hot. That's usually what we would do when you start feeling hot. You take some salt tablets.
And when you couldn't find any salt tablets, did you ask anyone?
I don't recall.
Mr. Blanton, you stated that you know how to mark off sick. So if you know how to mark off sick, why didn't you do that?
There was no reason to mark off sick, sir. As I stated previously, I was working all day, and at the end of the day, I felt sick, and I just wanted to sit down and rest for a couple of minutes.
Well, now, Mr. Blanton, I'm thoroughly confused. You say there was no reason to mark off sick, but the very first thing you said when you were woken up was that you felt sick. If you felt sick, why didn't you mark off sick?
Because if I'm remembering that day, what I wanted to do was rest for a couple of minutes and then finish my work, or at least try to. There was a lot of work to do that day.
I see. So at the time that you were woken up, you neither asked for, you neither marked off in accordance with the instructions, and you did not ask for any medical assistance. Is that correct?
I don't remember.
Did you ask for any medical assistance?
No, I don't think so.
Did you ask anyone to take you to the doctor or a hospital?
No, I didn't get a chance to do any of that because they basically took me off the property. I think they took me out of service. Actually, they put me in my car.
Well, so when Lieutenant Pantoja escorted you to your car and you got in, did you ask anyone to drive you home, or did you drive yourself home?
drove myself home.
All right, very well. I don't have any further questions at this time. Does the union want to ask any questions under redirect?
So my question to you is, were there tasks that you completed were there tasks that you completed during the day?
Yes,
Okay. And I believe that your testimony was that you performed the cleaning services in certain offices as far as emptying garbage cans and mopping. Is that correct?
yes, sir.
Okay. And I believe your testimony was that you installed blinds. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And you began, your testimony was that you began using the weed eater and performed that service until the weed eater malfunctioned. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Again, the shape of the yard or the condition of the yard had been neglected as far as janitorial duties. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And so again, would it be possible for you to have cleaned the entire yard in this one day?
There's no way.
Okay. And again, to the best of your ability, did you perform the duties that were assigned to you in the janitor position?
Yes, sir, I did.
Okay. No further questions at this time.
Mr. Blanton, to clarify, did you clean all of the offices, storerooms, engineers and swishmans, wash and locker rooms at Passenger Station, Davis Yard, in accordance with the instructions?
No, sir, it would have been
Did you?
impossible to do that.
That's quite all right.
I'm
It was,
Did you?
I'm sorry, objection, Mr. Hearing Officer. Earlier, when Mr. Lakin tried to elaborate on an answer that was a yes or no answer, you restricted me from moving to the next question. I would have asked that you provide the claimant the exact same opportunity to be able to finish answering your question and elaborate as he sees fit.
Mr. Hollis, your objection is noted for the record, and I will allow the claimant then to finish his statement, but I must state for the record that I find the union's hypocrisy in this matter a bit unsettling. You sternly objected to my allowing Mr. Lakin to elaborate on his questions, and you were emphatic that if you ask a yes or no question, you wanted it answered in such that way, and yet you don't want to afford that same opportunity to the company. However, in the interest of fairness and because this is a fair and impartial investigation, I will allow the witness to elaborate on his answer if he chooses to do so.
To be clear, the organization is not demonstrating hypocrisy. You were restricting my line of questioning that was deliberate, and that was the basis of the objection. So again, I would ask that Mr. Blanton be allowed to answer the question.
Mr. Blanton, do you have anything further you wish to add to that question, to your answer?
what I was saying was that it was physically impossible for me to get all of that work done on that day.
Did you make anyone aware that it was impossible to get all of that done in one day?
I was working and I didn't see anybody that day, except for my guy Kevin, except for Kevin.
So you did not see the terminal superintendent that day?
I did at the end of the day,
I see. And
when I got escorted off the property.
So your testimony, Mr. Blanton, is a little bit contradictory here, so I need to be clear. Did you or did you not see anyone else that day?
I saw the lieutenant, as I said in my statement, sir, I saw the lieutenant and the superintendent at the end of the day when I was told to leave.
So when you saw the superintendent that day, did you make the superintendent aware that it would have been impossible for you to get that work done all in one day?
No, I didn't tell him that. I was escorted off the property, sir.
Okay. Did you maintain and keep the engineers and switchmen's wash and locker rooms clean in their entirety at Davis Yard that day?
No, sir, I didn't have time to complete all those tasks.
Did you, well, okay, you didn't have time, or the time that you had, you spent lying down sleeping as opposed to working? Which is it?
That's absolutely not true, sir. I did not spend my time sleeping.
Then explain to me, Mr. Blanton, just one more time for clarification purposes, how were you found by the superintendent and the lieutenant? In what position?
On the bench,
In what type of position?
laying down.
And were your eyes open or closed?
I don't remember. They could have been closed.
Very well. Very well. Mr. Blanton, did you handle any baggage at the, or mail at the passenger station that day?
I don't remember.
Mr. Blanton, did you replace any posters or bulletins at Davis Yard that day?
I think I did.
But you don't know if you did or you didn't.
Well, sir, that was almost 2 weeks ago. It's difficult to remember everything that happened over 2 weeks ago.
But you remember going to the yard office and looking for salt tablets and couldn't find any.
Yes, sir.
And you remember getting exactly 40 bags of ice from the ice house.
That's correct.
And you remember that you were working with your coworker Kevin on that exact day 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
So it seems like you have a very selective memory in what's hard to remember and what's hard to forget. But the point of this, Mr. Blanton, my line of testimony is, as I read down the bulletin's instructions of your job duties of that day, it doesn't appear to me that you did a single thing on this list in a satisfactory manner. So again, for clarification purposes, I'm sure you can
Objection,
understand.
Mr. Hearing Officer.
I will get to your objection in just a minute, Mr. Hollis. If I can just complete my line of questioning, I will be glad to hear
Well,
anything
you're
you have
not,
to say.
that's the problem. You're not on a line of questioning. You're adding your take on this, and you're scolding the claimant, and you're giving to us the recap as you see it. I have no problem with you asking questions, but you're not asking questions. That's my objection.
Mr. Hollis, your objection is noted for the record, and at this time, I have no further questions of Mr. Blanton. Does the union have any other witnesses?
I have a few more questions to follow up with Mr. Blanton.
Please proceed.
Mr. Blanton, you have read Exhibit A, the charge letter, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. In Exhibit A, do you see where you are charged with not marking off properly? Is that contained in the charge letter?
No, it is not.
Okay. And Mr. Blanton, in the charge letter, is there a specific charge of alleging that you were sleeping?
No, sir. It does not say that.
Okay. And again, just for clarification on the date in question, to the best of your ability, were you doing the duties that are assigned to the janitor position?
Yes, sir.
Okay. No further questions at this time, so to recall.
All right, Mr. Hollis, I believe you stated you have no further questions for Mr. Blanton. I have no further questions. Does the union have any other witnesses they would like to call?
We do. We'd like to call Mr. Kevin Lofton, who was on duty and has firsthand knowledge of the matter under investigation.
Very well, we'll call Mr. Kevin Lofton. Mr. Lofton, as we get started, you have been sequestered during this entire time, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Did you discuss this case with anyone outside of this room?
I did not.
Very well. Mr. Hollis, please proceed.
Mr. Lofton, so you were working at Davis Yard on March the 30th when Mr. Blanton was called to work the janitor position. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So do you have anything that you could offer in regards to, you heard the charge letter, do you remember anything specifically about Mr. Blanton and the performance of his duties of the janitor position on that date?
Yes, sir, I do. I've actually prepared something, a statement for that.
Sure, would you mind reading it for us?
Yes, sir. I saw Mr. Blanton working around the yard office on March the 30th, 2017. He swept and mopped the floors and emptied the trash cans. That was early in the day. I saw him working on the Venetian blinds also. He seemed to be doing his job to me. The place has been a mess for some time now because we haven't had anyone here to clean it up. We cut grass together for a while later in the morning. After lunch, we went to City Ice Plant. It's about 2.5 miles from the yard, and picked up 40 bags of ice. We brought them back to the ice house. After that, we picked up some trash around the yard. Then I left to go out to the passenger station to do some work there. That was about 2:00 p.m. At that time, claimant Mr. Blanton was sitting out in front of the yard office. When I was relieved at about 2:45 p.m., I ran into Mr. Blanton outside the yard office. He asked me to help him get the weed eater started he was using. It's a gas model. I helped him get it started, and I left to go home.
Okay, so at various points throughout the day, you were working around or with Mr. Blanton, is that correct?
That's correct.
And you observed Mr. Blanton sweeping the offices and the restrooms, is that correct?
He was doing a great job, yes, sir.
Okay. And you observed Mr. Blanton performing the duty of mopping, is that correct?
He was mopping.
And you observed Mr. Blanton installing blinds, is that correct?
Venetian blinds, yes, sir.
Venetians, okay. And you assisted Mr. Blanton with cutting grass in the morning,
Yes, sir, that's correct.
and you accompanied Mr. Blanton to the city ice plant to get ice to take back to the ice house, is that correct?
Some 40 bags, yes, sir.
Okay. And you assisted Mr. Blanton in picking up trash at various places around the yard, is that correct?
I did, yes.
Okay. And then it's your testimony that Mr. Blanton needed help getting the weed eater restarted, and that was around 2:45, is that correct?
Yes, sir, around 2:45. It was a gas model, and he was having some problems with it, so I had assisted him to get it started.
Okay. So on the date in question, then you and Mr. Blanton were busy performing various duties that are related to a janitor position, is that correct?
Yes, sir, the place was a wreck. It really needed a lot of attention.
Okay. Okay, I don't have any other questions of Mr. Lofton at this time, subject to recall.
Mr. Lofton, I'd like to ask a couple clarification questions. So to be clear, when you left Mr. Blanton, the weed eater was working then?
Yes, I assisted in getting it started.
Okay. And you had testified that Mr. Blanton was doing a great job in your opinion, so let me ask you this. Is sleeping part of his job?
Objection, Mr. Hearing Officer. Again, there has been no formal charges placed against Mr. Blanton with regards to sleeping.
All right. Your objection is noted for the record. Mr. Lofton, let me ask you this. Did you witness Mr. Blanton clean all of the offices, storerooms, engineers, and switchmen's wash and locker rooms at Passenger Station Davis Yard per the instructions?
I'm not sure about all as per instructions, but I did eyewitness Mr. Blanton doing his job when I did see him.
Did you, since you spent so much time with Mr. Blanton that day, did you observe him lying down in the storeroom?
No, sir.
Were you aware that he had to be woken up by the superintendent and the lieutenant of special services?
No, sir.
Did he ever say to you that he was sick that day?
No, he didn't.
Did you observe Mr. Blanton maintain and keep the entire grounds clean at Passenger Station Davis Yard that day?
Mr. Blanton was doing everything to the best of his ability, just as I was.
Mr. Lofton, I appreciate your candor, but my question is, did you observe Mr. Blanton maintain and keep clean the entire grounds at Passenger Station Davis Yard that day?
Mr. Blanton, again, was doing the best job that he could do.
The best job that he could do?
Yes, sir. On the jobs that he was assigned and doing of what I witnessed, he was doing his job.
So I guess safe it to say then maybe that the best job that Mr. Blanton could do may not be of satisfactory performance.
Objection, Mr. Hearing Officer. You're asking Mr. Lofton to suppose what Mr. Lakin intends in the vague language that he included in the charge letter. That's not. Mr. Lofton's responsibility is to provide eyewitness and factual testimony of the charges at hand with regard to the date in question. That's it.
Mr. Hollis, your objection's noted for the record, and along those lines, then, Mr. Lofton, since the union and I are both now requesting that you answer your eyewitness account, did you witness Mr. Blanton maintain and keep clean the entire grounds at Passenger Station Davis Yard that day?
Again, when I witnessed Mr. Blanton was performing his duties.
At this time, I have no further questions for the witness. Mr. Hollis, do you have any follow-up questions?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. You were not performing, you were not assigned to the position of janitor on the date in question, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So you would not be working with Mr. Blanton for the entirety of a shift. The duties that you're assigned to would be overlapping, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And Mr. Blanton testified that on the day in question, it was unseasonably hot. Do you recall if was that your recollection of the day?
Yes, sir, it was hot out.
Okay. And Superintendent Lakin said that he had been looking for Mr. Blanton from about 1 p.m. until after 3 p.m. But your testimony was that prior to 2:45 p.m., you were with Mr. Blanton at various locations and observing him doing different functions. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Okay. At any time, did the superintendent, Mr. Lakin, ask you about Mr. Blanton's whereabouts?
No, he did not. I didn't see the superintendent.
Okay. All right. And so from 1 p.m. until 2:45 p.m., between 1 p.m. and 2:45 p.m., were you on duty?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
You were on duty. And during that time, you were, again, assisting Mr. Blanton or interacting with Mr. Blanton in various duties?
Yes, I had help assist him on a couple of duties.
Okay. And you did not see or hear from Superintendent Lakin with regard to Mr. Blanton's whereabouts?
No, sir, I did not.
Okay. All right. So you've worked at Davis Yard for some time, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And in working at Davis Yard, you've noticed that the janitor's position has gone unfilled for a number of weeks, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And is it your testimony then that that somebody would be able to come in? Is it possible for somebody to come in and be able to perform the entire janitor's functions or janitor's
Mr. Hollis,
duties
I'm going to interrupt
in
you
one-
right there. This witness is not an expert in this case. His opinion would have nothing to do with the letter of charge or the satisfactory performance of Mr. Blanton, and his opinion of whether or not the yard could or could not have been cleaned in this case is immaterial. So I'm going to ask you to move on from that line of questioning.
Okay. So that the record reflects that the hearing officer is restricting a line of question from the organization to one of its witnesses.
To be clear, Mr. Hollis, I'm not restricting anything. I am, as I said in my instructions in the beginning, maintaining order and determining which questions are pertinent to this case and which questions are not, as is my assigned duties in this matter.
Okay. Mr. Lofton, have you ever performed the janitor position at Davis Yard?
Mr. Hollis,
No, I
again,
have not.
that question is irrelevant in this case. We are here to determine all of the facts surrounding the charges of Mr. Blanton's unsatisfactory work performance. So whether or not Mr. Lofton has done the job or not is of no value in this case. I do not deem it relevant, and I'm going to ask you to move on.
Okay. Again, the record should reflect that the hearing officer is restricting the organization from asking a question to one of its witnesses.
Mr. Hollis, I've made it perfectly clear to you that while I am not restricting anything, I am performing my assigned duties and using my judgment to determine what is and what is not relevant in this case.
So am I restricted from asking the question or not?
You are not restricted from asking any pertinent questions in this hearing.
But the two questions that I just asked, I am not allowed to ask, correct?
The two questions that you just asked are not pertinent in this case, and I'm asking you to move on, please.
Okay. So I just wanted to make sure that I understood your instruction. Okay, so again, Mr. Lofton, your testimony is that you were working with Mr. Blanton on the date in question throughout the day in a variety of roles related to the janitorial function until you got off of work around 2:45, is that correct?
That's correct.
And at no time did you observe Mr. Blanton performing or doing anything unsatisfactorily, is that correct?
No, he was doing his job to the best of his ability, and the place was horrendously trashed. It was dirty. There was it hadn't been cleaned in weeks.
Okay, all right. And how many years' service do you have with NATCO?
5 years.
5 years, okay.
Okay. I have no further questions at this time. Mr. Hollis?
Yeah, just a couple of questions to follow up. You work at Davis Yard, is that correct?
That's correct.
Is it routine that bulletins and posters are updated every day at Davis Yard?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. Okay, I don't have any other questions for Mr. Lofton at this time, subject to recall.
Very well, Mr. Lofton. The union has requested that you remain subject to recall, so I will remind you not to discuss this matter with anyone outside of this room and make yourself available in case the union or the company wants to ask you any further questions.
Yes, sir.